Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening to you all and a happy May Day. My name's Chris Brown. I'm the producer of Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press. And it's my great pleasure tonight to welcome you all to what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting discussion. For those of you who don't know, this live stream is one of the very first events in Radical May, which is a really exciting new collaboration between Littoral, the radical festival of books and ideas, and dozens of radical publishers all around the world. The idea behind Radical May is simple. With the ongoing pandemic, it's more important than ever to think about and to discuss the ideas that will bring about the profound transformations that our societies need. And so for the next month, there's going to be a program of roundtables, talks, debates doing just that. And the calendar is already filling up with some amazing events. So do take a look. There's a link to the full schedule in the video description below. We want to reach as many people as possible. So do share the link among your friends, your networks, and the hashtag for this is Radical May. Now, just before I introduce our two speakers tonight, I have one more quick announcement. The current lockdown poses a real existential threat for small independent publishers like Pluto. But we think that our books and our authors are needed now more than ever. And so to that end, we've recently launched a Patreon page. If you like what we do and you want to support us, then you can sign up as a patron from just £3 a month. In addition to our immense gratitude, there are some really great member benefits too. And these include free ebooks, exclusive online content, merch, discounts on our website, and a whole lot else besides. So after tonight's event, do head over to patreon.com/Pluto Press. Okay, I think that's the housekeeping over. So tonight's discussion is titled Life Making, Capitalism and the Pandemic, Feminist Ideas about Women's Work. And we're very lucky to be joined by two of the leading lights of social reproduction theory. Susan Ferguson, Associate Professor Emeritus at Wilfrid Laurier, and author of the new book, Women and Work. And we're very lucky to be joined as well by Tithi Bhattacharya, a Marxist historian and activist, and she's Professor of South Asian History at Purdue University, and also on the editorial board of Spectre. Her edited collection, Social Reproduction Theory, Remapping Class, Recentering Oppression, is also available from plutobooks.com. Now there's going to be a live Q&A tonight, so if you want to put a question to our speakers, then you can just write it in the live chat, and then we'll feed it to them later on in the discussion. But that's all from me, so I'm very excited now to hand over to Tithi and Sue.
Everyone can hear me.
Recentering Oppression is also available from Pluto.
Very happy May Day to everyone, and thank you very much for joining us on this live event. And I'm so excited that we are starting off actually a whole series of talks on how to change the world. So please, along with us, please do support Pluto Press and the various other radical presses that we all love and have shaped our thinking. Today's talk, well, first of all, it's such a privilege to share May Day with one of your closest friends. So I'm just so happy to do this with Sue. Today's talk is about life making and social reproduction theory during a pandemic. One of the, I think, two images I will carry with me in years to come when I think of this extraordinary period in human history. Two images for me that define the pandemic. One is the image of Italians, ordinary Italians, singing to each other across balconies. And the other is of the Indian police hosing down migrant workers with bleach as they made an effort to go home, walking cross country across the entire subcontinent because their workplaces closed down and public transport closed down. So for me, these two images kind of embody two kinds of responses to the pandemic. One is the response of ordinary people to the pandemic, which was the singing, but also another thought that came to me was Palestinian farmers, Palestine being one of the most oppressed regions of the world, but Palestinian farmers leaving food for neighbors and co-workers by the side of the road, fresh produce so that people could take it. So these extraordinary acts of human solidarity from ordinary people, which were acts to sustain life. And the extraordinary acts of repression and carceral discipline coming from their side, capitalist side, which includes the hosing down of people with bleach. Just to give you another Indian example, the police actually, in order to protect people, because they have suddenly become the agents of welfare, the police shot down a man, just killed him outright because he had stepped out of his house to buy biscuits or cookies. And of course, the man was Muslim. So these two extraordinary exact opposite responses to the pandemic, I think, mark what we understand to be capitalism's relationship to life making and social reproduction. Okay, so ordinary examples of such diametrically opposite response, of course, dot the landscape of the current crisis. But what we want to focus on is how the pandemic is tragically exposing that while what is needed is a concentration on saving and sustaining life, capitalism is concerned only with saving the economy or profits, to the extent that all of the heads of state now want to open up the economy. And a Texan politician actually went absolutely public to say, we are ready to sacrifice our grandparents. So this relationship between profit making and life making under capitalism is the focus of what we've been talking about, which is social reproduction theory. So what are the main arguments of social reproduction theory? That while capitalism as a system only cares about profit, profit being capital's lifeblood and motor, the system has, capitalism as a system has a relationship of reluctant dependence on processes and institutions of life making. The system is dependent on workers to produce commodities, which are then sold to make profits. The system thus can only survive if workers' lives are reproduced continuously and reliably while being replaced generationally. Food, housing, public transport, public schools, and hospitals are all ingredients of life making that socially reproduce workers and their families. The level of access to them often determines the fate of the working class as a whole, and women still perform the bulk of life making work globally. But capital is also reluctant to spend any portion of its profits on processes that sustain and maintain life. This is why all care work is devalued or underpaid under capitalism, or fully unpaid in the domestic sphere, while institutions of life-making such as schools and hospitals are either constantly privatized or underfunded. What is happening during this particular crisis is that the coronavirus, because it is a public health crisis, is suddenly forcing capitalism to temporarily prioritize life making. Okay, so the focus of our discussion should be on the temporary nature and the forced nature of it. Capitalism normally would not set up new hospitals, would not normally subsidize the wages of workers in order for them to be able to stay home, which is what the British government is doing, paying 80% of workers' wages. Normally, draconian immigration laws are being relaxed, while posh hotels are being commandeered to house the homeless. But we also have to understand that we are also seeing a simultaneous escalation in the carceral functions of capitalist states. Okay, so several states like Israel, Hungary have increased their sort of centralizing dictatorial powers. So what we are looking at is a public health crisis where questions and the work of social reproduction is gathering immense salience for the first time, okay? So governments have had to make a list of essential services, and no one put stockbrokers or bankers on that list. What's on the list is the work of essential workers, caregivers, nurses, doctors, teachers. These are the essential workers who are on every government's list. So that's suddenly we have a situation where social reproduction is revealed for the first time to many as being the essential task, not just of life making, but also world making. Okay. So that is sort of, I want to say, as far as the sort of introduction to today's discussion is in sort of setting the context of where social reproduction theory and the pandemic interface, right? How do we use SRT to understand what we are going through in the pandemic, but also what lessons can we draw coming out of the pandemic in mobilizing social reproduction theory? And who better to talk about it than Susan Ferguson, whose book you see here. It's a wonderful book, and it's part of the ongoing series, the first of which is the other SRT book. So Sue's book, I want to make a plug for it in these terms, okay? So a lot of people are plugging books during the pandemic because we are all in lockdown. And we're recommending to each other, hey, we suddenly have a lot of free time, read this book. This is not one of those books. I am recommending it not because you have a lot of free time and you should use it, but this book is actually a weapon of sorts. It is a weapon, not just a tool to understand the pandemic and women's role in it and what role feminist theory can play to explain it, but it is also a weapon in order to arm us into the challenges that we will face from capital and the ways we need to fight against that to build a better world. So without further ado, I'm such a privilege to introduce Sue.
Thanks, Tiffany. That's very, very kind and very much appreciated. And thanks to Pluto too and the Radical book publishers and the festival as well for pulling this all together. This is pretty amazing to be part of. So I really appreciate that. And hello to people out there who I can't see. I hope you're all keeping safe and coping as well as you can. So I was really just going to talk a tad about, just briefly a little bit about the book, and then talk more specifically about some of the, sort of unpack a little bit more of that reluctant dependence that Tiffy so nicely summed up for us of capital on life making, and how during the pandemic we're really seeing that come to the fore. This all together. This is pretty amazing. So just briefly on the book, so people understand what I do in that book is I have a kind of historical argument at the beginning, which was motivated by my trying to come to terms with why and how it has come about that the dominant Western socialist feminist approach to talking about women's work and about social reproductive work in particular could not ever accommodate, could never get over a kind of dual systems approach to understanding capitalism and gender oppression. And so I do that I go back and I trace various thinkers that I've kind of cherry picked along the way to try to decipher from the history of those ideas how a kind of moralistic, rationalist kind of approach to understanding women's oppression had crept into a socialist feminist perspective, and the perspective which I call critical equality feminism, and how that differs from a social reproduction theory approach to the same sorts of questions. And one of the key things that I argue is that whereas critical equality feminism sees women's oppression as stemming from the nature of the work that of social reproductive work, that mostly the unpaid care work, the fact that it's isolated, that it's hard, that it's often dirty manual work or whatever. The social reproduction feminism is much more interested in the relationship between capital and the work. It's not focusing on the nature of the work so much. And so I make that argument. And then I go on to talk about the sort of debates within social reproduction feminism and how it's developed and evolved. I think especially in the last 10 years or so, it's become really, really interesting because it's finally been able to lose the shackles of just talking about housework and as social reproductive work, and actually thinking about all the things that people do in different communities, in communities of color and disabled communities, and in our daily lives, the things that are the concrete realities of our daily lives, that we do to create better conditions for our social reproduction, for our life making. And it's that whole gambit, not just the housework, that actually keeps and sustains a workforce available for capital to exploit. And it's a very particular type of workforce that is one that is differentiated by race, by gender, by ability, by age, by all sorts of things. And that capital has a real interest in, or a tendency to sustain those differences and to keep people apart in those ways. So anyway, that's sort of what the book does. I really love the term that Tiffy has used now in a couple recent essays, reluctant dependence of capital on life and life making. And I think what the pandemic has done, we've seen, as Tiffy was explaining, this sort of the states jumping into action when there's an existential threat to life. But the way in which social reproduction theory, I think, helps us kind of really understand and get to sort of a deeper understanding of what that is all about, and also provides us with some tools for thinking about how do we get over this. I think I can talk about it in sort of three ways. So the three things that that I think it's particularly good at helping us understand is, on the first, the reasons why such support is and can only ever be, support for life making under capitalism right now, is and can only be reluctant. That is, it can only be minimal, it's temporary, it's provisional, and it's really purely strategic on capital's part. So that's one thing. Second thing is that it can also help us, the theory can also help us understand why some groups have been more vulnerable to this pandemic than other groups. So I'll talk about that a bit too. And then finally, I think it also can help point us how to politically strategize our way out of there, or give us some tools for that. So first, in terms of understanding that what we're seeing now in terms of the states jumping into action, the state and capital to some degree jumping into action to support people's lives, it can only and will only be a minimal kind of response and a temporary response. Social reproduction theory helps us understand that in the first place, capitalism's care infrastructure is weak, just to begin with, because it is devalued and defunded, and therefore it's been ill-equipped to respond to this pandemic, despite the warnings that we've had in the years leading up to the pandemic. It also can help us explain why certain segments of the population, prisoners and sex workers and detained migrants, people who are, why they're being neglected by some of the state actions that are happening now, because they're people whose lives have been deemed unproductive or extraneous to, or a cost to the system. And so they're not the priority for today's actions. We're also seeing, I think, it's also an explanation for why, as I think Tiffy pointed this out, we're seeing such early back to work protocols, because profits do matter more than people's lives. And we can also expect, coming from a social reproduction theory perspective, that the pandemic will be used to justify further austerity. Already there's been announcements of huge cuts in healthcare and education. Alberta, for instance, is redirecting $128 million of education funding to COVID-19 response, but they're also cutting drastically at the hospitals and the healthcare system. 43,000 healthcare workers in the States have lost their jobs already because of the shutting down of other healthcare healthcare services. At least three, there may well be more, UK universities have canceled all contract faculty contracts right now. And we were getting arguments, certainly in Texas, we're getting arguments about how we really should be putting more online learning in public schools and that sort of thing. So these are all like incremental ways in which they're prepping us to be prepared for greater austerity post-pandemic, and in some cases starting right now. So the second thing was why SRT can also help us understand why some social groups are more vulnerable to the pandemic than others. And we've seen this as people know, women and racialized people who are most likely to be the front line, low paid, less protected social reproductive workers are going to be more exposed to the risks. Older people living in assisted living facilities who have, passed their quote best before dates for capitalist exploitation. And that is, they're no longer useful to capital. They're no longer productive or potentially productive of capitalist value or profit. But we're also seeing that those whose conditions of social reproduction in non-pandemic times are devalued and or those people who have a more stressed kind of conditions of social reproduction and are less healthy and less educated to begin with are also more vulnerable to this. So people who have pre-existing conditions, and in the US, a lot of attention has been paid to the African American population, who tend to have high rates of diabetes and hypertension. So they're more susceptible. And social reproduction theory helps us understand that a little bit, because I think a lot, because its insistence that life-making work is not structured just through gendered relations, but through racial, cis hetero, ableist, colonialist, and other oppressive relations. And so that's, I think, something that we need to flesh out and can flesh out more. Then the third point, and I'll end on this, is that I think SRT is also really relevant for strategizing politically in this moment. And I imagine that much of the discussion period, this would be a good thing to come back to talk more about. But just to briefly say, SRT identifies a systemic tendency within capitalism to degrade and devalue life-making. And so in doing that, it then identifies kind of a systemic revolutionary, I guess, potentially revolutionary agent in everybody who is involved in actually countering that tendency to degrade their life-making activities. And people who are working to sustain and improve the conditions of social reproduction. And those are the paid and the unpaid workers, social reproduction workers. And they have a role. We see how important their role is in sustaining capitalism in the pandemic so starkly, because they're the people who capital is now really depending on to maintain the economy. And not only is it just the paid workers and nurses and the other healthcare workers and so on, it's also, and the people actually who are delivering along the food chain, it's also all the people, those health from below initiatives. And I think this is something that that is worth, really emphasizing too. People who have self-organized, feeding other people, the transit workers who go on strike for safer transit, the people volunteering to babysit for essential workers, those care workers who are unpaid, but are also so crucial to keeping this economy going. It does really point out how strategically important social reproductive workers are. And so from the SRT perspective, the goal is to push for a greater politicization of those resisting in this way and those working in these ways by highlighting their common need to resist capital, the capitalist organization of life making, and find alternative ways of life making through a solidaristic mobilization from below. Like we can talk more about that too. And I think one thing I just want to really emphasize is in that process, I think it's super, super important that we don't just start from, that we prioritize the people who are the most marginalized in this, because we can see too how they're exactly the people that capitalism has left behind in this period. So actually working with prison populations, working with detained migrants, those are the people who in some ways stand the most to lose right now, but are also then the ones where they're very critical edge against the capitalist system operating as normal. So I hope that was somewhat clear.
It was lovely. Thank you. Hey, so it was, I just want to follow up from you and just also let folks know that Sue and I also edit this series of social reproduction theory from Pluto Press, and I'm really excited to announce our next book. So right following from Sue is Aaron Jaffe's book, and it's titled Social Reproduction Theory and the Socialist Horizon: Work, Power, and Political Strategy. So it's a marvelous book that Sue and I are both very proud to include in our series, and it goes very much into detail of things that Sue's been talking about the strategic importance of social reproduction workers and social reproduction work, and a philosophical exploration of the theory in general and taking it in different directions. So I hope you guys listening in will give it your consideration. It's a wonderful book. So I want to pull back from the sort of hopeful note on which Sue ended, and think about two things. And I want to hear, Sue, your take on it as well, which is, one of the things that is becoming clear, to use the language of capitalist healthcare corporations in the US, which is the pre-existing condition. One thing that is becoming clear is that race and gender are pre-existing conditions under capitalism, right? So they are basically the ways in which class, as Stuart Hall said, is experienced, but it is also ways in which class exploitation is enhanced, either on individual bodies or on entire social groups, right? So I want to bring here, we've been talking about social reproduction as life making, but I do want to think about capitalism as death making. So especially, today's New York Times had this horrific report on how New York the city is unable to bury its dead, that bodies are piling up. And so a very, very gruesome and very heartbreaking. And even when people have been able to say goodbye to their loved ones, it's been impossible to have funerals or memorial services, leaving people, having an entirely different, I think, non-collective experience of death can be extremely traumatic. So, so this has prompted, I think, some of our thinking on death making, or capitalism as a death making enterprise. And so one way that I think about it is that while capitalism privatizes life making, or tries to privatize life making in all of its aspects, it is also a system that socializes death making. Okay, so it privatizes life and life making, but socializes death, in the sense that, you
Right.
know, there are certain ways in which capitalism just directly manufactures death. You know, so for instance, it profits off of trade and production that literally kills people, be it through, you know, ecologically devastating processes, industrial waste, that, and also the direct death making of the military, so literally killing people with
Mhm.
bombs. But it is also capitalism's death making is not simply that kind of direct sort of death, but it is inherent in the logic of capitalism, because the system is, as Sue explained, is actually structured to undervalue life, even to ignore life making processes. So, by undervaluing and ignoring life to the greatest extent, it is also a death making system in the indirect way
Mhm.
rather than the direct way, right? So, I mean, we know of these horror stories in you know, U.S. hospitals where someone arrives, you know, dying, and the hospital authorities want to see whether they have insurance or will be able to pay
Mhm.
for the service. You know, um, we are looking at, during the pandemic, as Sue said, you know, a time when people need hospitals, and actually states are investing and, you know, setting up field hospitals, as we used to call them, in various places. Many states are actually closing hospitals and firing healthcare workers. Okay, there was this hospital near my town in Chicago, which is it's, and of course the hospital was in the south side of Chicago, which is mostly people of color communities live. And there, the people, the hospital bosses thought this was a great time during a pandemic to actually close the hospital. And none of the nurses and none of the healthcare workers had any, you know, idea that this was happening. But thankfully, they organized brilliant protests, and the bosses had to go back on it. So in these ways, you can just see that the profit motive actually makes it very clear that capitalism has to be death making too, simply by undervaluing life. But
Mhm.
you know, I think the and as Sue explained, that it is not death making on an equal scale, you know, also, because if it was, then, you know, the fact that Prince Charles got it, or, you know,
Yes.
Justin Trudeau's wife got it, would have had the same effect as, you know, when 40% of
Mhm.
the Black people in Georgia tested positive, except Prince Charles and Justin Trudeau's wife probably had the best care possible, and lived right through it, while racialized people and, you know, the most vulnerable across the world are actually the most affected through this crisis. So again, I think if we talk about that question of the pre-existing conditions and the death making of capitalism, then we see how those two things come together, especially during a sort of public health crisis. That the public health crisis again clarifies for us tragically how certain people and certain lives are more disposable than others. So I want to hear, Sue, your kind of opinion on what you make of this sort of
Yeah.
death making drive of capitalism, because on the one hand, it has to sustain life making for
Mhm.
its projects, but it also has a death making drive.
Yeah. No, thanks, Tiffany. I think you've articulated a lot of the really key points there in terms of the overall dynamic. And I mean, one of the things that's interesting is when you think about it, life making is in some ways a way of death making too, in the sense that where, you know, what is a human organism, any organism lives and then dies. And so every aspect of your life is moving you closer towards death. And so the state, and insofar as it manages and balances out manages our social reproduction, is really doing a kind of balancing act between supporting life and supporting death in some ways. And so and deciding when and who should die, and when or who and when they should die, and who should live, and whose lives are more important than others, and those sorts of things. And so I think that's a key element of social reproduction theory, and to think through. I think it's a really interesting thing. I know Silvia Federici has done some nice work too on care in elder homes and that kind of management of death. So social dying can be done in a caring way, but it's not under capitalism. So that's the other side of it. Is you talked about the bodies lining up in New York, was it, that you're mentioning? But think too of in Ecuador, the bodies that you're seeing just on the streets that are being left to die, and that's just so incredibly sad and incredibly brutal, and incredibly not it's certainly not the sort of death that people imagine for themselves, I'm sure, and it's certainly not a caring death. And I think actually thinking about internationally is also interesting, just to move beyond the States too, to think through and to try to strategize a little bit more about what what this pandemic has meant internationally. For you have whole countries where, because of the trade agreements that they've entered into, because of the legacy of colonialism and imperialism, that they have massive debts to Western banks, and they have been forced to defund their own healthcare infrastructure. And so you have whole countries that cannot afford to keep people alive, and are actually actively, they can't afford the competition right now to buy the ventilators and the masks that they need, and even not even just keep them alive, but keep people relatively safe too. And so you have the bodies stacking up on the streets of Ecuador. You have people, which is quite phenomenal, I think, in Lebanon this week, where there's just dire poverty, coming out and deciding that it's better to defy social distancing and take the risk of death, to be in the streets fighting, because otherwise they're just going to die at home. So these are the sorts of these are the sorts of situations that capitalism can put us into. And I think I really like your notion of how it does privatize life, and in privatizing life, it kind of socializes death making, because it is now the case that whole process of death making is determined through racialized, gendered, just various structures and dynamics of oppressive relationships, relations. And I think that it's another indictment of capitalism, of course, and it's something that we should be talking more about, and especially, and I think the COVID-19 period has brought this home to us too. And and then the only other thing that I would add to this, I think, is that while there is absolutely a tendency in capitalism toward treating different bodies as disposable and towards bare life, to use that term, there's a limit too. As we've seen in the pandemic shows us that there's a limit to that too. There's an internal limit, because capital ultimately does need human labor power, and so its response to which is what explains this sort of really bifurcated, temporary, reluctant response to the pandemic, because the health of the whole body in a pandemic relies on the health of the individual, right? And that's Alex de Waal had a nice quote that I had written down here, where he says, he's an epidemiologist, unless all parts of the body politic conformed to the same central protocol, the health of the whole would be vulnerable to the deficiencies of its weakest parts. And so, states have jumped into action, as we talked about at the beginning, to try and maintain and bolster up our health. Yet they can only do so by kind of resorting to a command social reproduction regime, by where they are from the top down, through increasingly repressive state apparatuses, marshaling and policing populations, and providing some help to some but not to everybody. And again, they can only, the help that they can do, they can only do by putting some other people, frontline workers, who tend to be women, who tend to be racialized, at greater risk. And so I think it's not a happy picture. I was going to say that's a much more that's a very sobering way to think about capitalism. But I think it is what the system, it shows us something about the true nature of the system.
So I know there are people who probably have lots of questions, but so I want to end on both emphasizing the dark, but also thinking through a little bit about sort of hopeful things. So the emphasizing of the dark, I think one of the things that both Sue and I, when we were planning this discussion, have been worried about is the conjunction here, which is between a global pandemic and an oncoming Great Depression. Okay, so this is something that we have to, in the coming days, take into account, that even if we do have a vaccine, which many are saying is not even going to happen, well, definitely not in 2020, and even 2021 is doubtful. I mean, between now and 2021, how many people will lose their jobs, lose their resources for life making, and be rendered homeless, foodless? The UN has already warned that we're looking at what the UN, not a revolutionary organization, has called a food pandemic, that there's going to be hunger stalking, especially countries of the global south. Meanwhile, well, at least the Indian government, and I'm sure other governments, are storing grain in warehouses in order to make profit from them and do the export economy, right, stuff, while people are literally starving. So what I think this discussion on death making makes me think about, and I'm still thinking aloud, is that on the one hand, we are disposable, as workers under the system, but we are also replaceable. So both of those functions work together, that workers, by their position in the system, they can be disposed of, but they also need to be replaced. So there has to be these two twains are constantly braided in capitalism, the disposing of workers and the replacing of workers. And this is why work that go towards both of those activities are undervalued completely. So lives have to be cheapened to such an extent that replacing life should not take away from capitalism's profit, right? So whereas, we are told that Prince Charles is irreplaceable, okay? So his position or his status is irreplaceable, whereas the rest of us, are of course replaceable. One nurse dead, what does it matter? We'll have more nurses, or what have you. I mean, I thought one of the most harrowing protests I've seen during the pandemic was where nurses from the National Nurses Union in the US stood in front of the White House reading out the names of their fallen comrades. I mean, this is a pandemic, and we have provided no infrastructural care for our nurses who are taking care of everyone. They're wearing garbage bags. So, you know, I think we have to take that twin functions of the system very seriously, the disposability and the replaceability. And that's why there must be processes that the system generates that makes life continuously vulnerable. Because if life becomes secure and if life flourishes, then both of those functions, replaceability and disposability, cannot take place, right? If life is precious. So you can't just say, hey, let's replace Prince Charles. Well, I say it all the time, and, you know, abolish the monarchy. But, you know, for capitalism, you can't replace these people because they're so unique and so precious. So the reverse is true for our class. So I think one of the things that I want to end on, I suppose, before we go to the question answer part, is what we want out of this crisis, right? Because this has been such a wake-up call for capitalism as well. And I think, you know, and not to say glib things about, you know, that the crisis is an opportunity to rebuild. I hate those tropes. What we should say is, however, that the crisis makes clear why we do have to change priorities, okay? Because we can see what would happen if priorities are not changed. Bodies piling up on the streets of our countries. These are bodies of people we know, we love, and the most vulnerable, right? And you know, I've said this before, that if we don't take this seriously as a left, then we won't understand that the extent of the climate emergency that is clearly coming and building up, right? So once the climate emergency comes, these pandemic days will seem like a holiday, okay? Because once the climate crisis goes beyond a particular point of recovery, then there is no coming back. There is no vaccine to fix the ozone layer. There is no vaccine to stop the melting of glaciers, right? So we're going to look at this unbelievable devastation that will be caused to human life across and all other life forms on this planet, right? So I think it is very, very important that we use this moment to basically strategize as a left as to why we absolutely cannot go back to capitalist normal. We need our normal. We need to establish our new normal. And one of those, I think, is the key that way to establish that is taking our lead from social reproduction theory, that our leaders and politicians must invest in life-making activities going forward. Because think about it, life-making activities like teaching and nursing and so on are also environmentally sustainable activities, right? These are not, we don't need the fossil fuels to teach children or to nurse the sick. So we need to get out of this economic devastation that is coming with the depression. We need massive public works from the government, which are not public works in building, you know, pipelines, but public works which are about the just transition. This is the correct moment for a Green New Deal, and so on. So we must emphasize that our politicians invest in life making and put their money into these institutions that sustain life and allow life to flourish, rather than bailing out airline industries and bailing out the billionaires, and of course, you know, giving us wonderful scientific tools like drinking bleach. So this is something that we have to insist as a left, because unless we change the direction of the so-called economy, then I think the very life-making activities of the entire planet will be challenged and endangered. So with that, I think we should open to questions. Or
Yeah. Cool. Thanks, Tithi. Yeah, we've had lots coming through on the live chat, so that's really lovely. Let me just grab one up and see what they've said. Okay, so the first question is, given most of social reproduction occurs within the family unit, how does the social reproduction theory look at domestic violence against women that's escalated during the pandemic?
Yes, I would say, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to say one way or the other whether most, depends on how broadly you're defining social reproduction. But so certainly a substantial amount of social reproduction happens within the household unit. And one of the things that we've seen that's been the tragedy of this pandemic is that that means the social isolation, as it's been commanded from on high, has meant that people have been stuck in homes with violent people. Women have been stuck in homes largely with violent partners. And the, one of the things I think that we need to argue is that this is precisely why a class response to capitalism has to put front and center the life-making possibilities and conditions that face women and other marginalized or oppressed people. Because had we been in a society in which, there had been a lot of support for shelters and opportunities for women and trans people to leave violent situations, then there would be a much that risk wouldn't have been exacerbated in this period. Similarly, I think we need to argue that rather than, what we really want to see in this sort of period is not the state just simply coming in and telling us what to do, but actually consulting with community leaders and community members and health experts to devise responses to the pandemic that actually fit the situation. And so again, had that happened, and had we been able to argue for that, you would then have feminists who work on anti-violence initiatives arguing for opening up hotels for victims of violence in the home. So I think a social reproduction perspective on that is to simply say that it is very much the support, a reason why you need to front and center the demands of the people who are whose work socially reproducing the household is crucial, but who may not, for whatever reason, be safe within that house as well. So I hope that's helpful.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Tithi, obviously feel free to jump in on any of these, otherwise I'll, I guess, move on to the next one. Okay, so the next question is, when we think of social reproduction theory bringing home the focus on the preconditions of capitalism in life-making and death-making, how does social reproduction theory help us to reimagine alternatives?
Obviously, just the way you framed it, I'm not sure who asked this question, so thank you. Just the way you framed it is, in a way, the way out, right? So we want to minimize systemic death making. Death is something that should be an individual biological process of bodies aging and being cared for in its in its journey from birth to death. Instead, what we have is a systemic death making, right? So instead, we all have to belong to certain collective systems. We're not suggesting that after the fall of capitalism we all go off into our and live individual lives. So we have to collectively organize society. And so the collective organizations of society should prioritize life making. So we're thinking about a society where we don't need drones to kill people. Okay, we don't need endless brands of toothpaste or endless brands of phones where I mean, just think about the iPhone. It is the thing that its mined, its parts are mined by almost semi-slave labor in Chile and in parts of Africa, and then it is made in factories where the conditions are so bad that they need to have nets down from the windows so that workers cannot jump out and commit suicide. So they have to have suicide notes, and so on. So this is a useless way to produce something that should help in human communication rather than assist in the deaths of so many people producing that commodity. So we want a system where, and the simple answer to that has always been the simple socialist answer, which is that those who produce the wealth of the world, those who produce the things that we need to sustain life, should have a collective say in how those goods are produced. More importantly, how those goods are distributed. Okay, so that tells you in a way where we want to go from here. That one of the things that we should aim towards is what Comrade Britney Spears clearly said, which is all wealth needs to be redistributed. So, coming from this, we want to say, think about wages, right? Like, when I started looking at the wage, the US government at the various states in US, my state, Ohio, first made these lists of who are the essential workers, right? So I looked at the list and then I compared it to the labor bureau's wage, like the national wage list, and tried to see how much the essential workers, i.e. life-making activity workers, were making and how much CEOs were making. So the average is CEOs make 10 times the wage of essential workers. That's the average. And in some cases, it's just, astronomically unequal. So we want a world where the wages of life-making social reproduction workers if there are wages, I'm saying that at least coming out of the pandemic, I want to say as an alternative, in a socialist society, obviously there are no wages, but coming out of the pandemic, we should demand that the wages of these comrades who are in the front lines of trying to save all of our lives should reflect the kind of work that they're doing, while the wages of CEOs reflect their utility to society. Okay, how useful is a CEO when you have been tested positive for COVID-19? Like none. So their wages should reflect their social utility, while the wages of essential workers should reflect that. So I think social reproduction theory, with its focus on life making and processes of life making, is very, very useful in trying to chart a path for us as to which jobs we actually need in an ideal society free from capitalism, and which jobs are absolutely useless.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tithi. I think the next question is specifically for Sue. Yes, so the question is, do you think that the fact that social reproduction workers are mostly women puts women workers in a special position or a better position for fighting or leading the anti-capitalist struggle?
Yes, and that I think that by sheer numbers, because there's a very important role for social reproduction workers to take on in fighting capitalism because of both their historic and current ties to care work, and to thinking through that their goal is often the improvement and betterment of people's living conditions. And I think that's something that resonates so widely with people who are both perhaps in their workplace, but also outside the workplace. And so there's a way in which their goals align with the goals. So we saw this in the teacher strikes, teachers' goals of improving their own jobs, but which is part of improving the classroom conditions and the conditions of student learning, align with the desires of people in the community, both of parents and of other citizens or non-citizens who want to have a safe and healthy community. So I think in that sense, yes, but I'd say more to the point, I think the fact that most social reproduction workers are women places a priority on putting feminist on making feminism, prioritizing feminism as part of the class struggle. And the fact that so many social reproduction workers are women of color or people of color places a priority on putting anti-racism as a priority in the struggle, the class struggle more broadly. And because I think it's through paying attention to women's concerns about sexual harassment, women's concerns about access to abortion or better health care, women, anti-racist concerns about lack of, undermining harassment at work or in schools or whatever, and safety, their own personal safety, about better pay. Those things are, if you prioritize those things, you're also building a stronger, more robust, I think, class response to capitalism.
Fantastic, thanks. Brilliant. Okay, I think we're going to do one more question and then we can sum up, because we know there's other events taking place tonight as well under the Radical May auspices, and we don't want to eat too much into them. So the last question then, there are initiatives done by majority poor, racialized, immigrant workers and women, sometimes organizing for the first time. So how do we take these movements from charity to revolutionary politics?
Well, I'm going to have a stab at it, and then maybe Sue, or do you want to go first, Sue?
No, you go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a hard question.
It is a very, very hard question, but it is one of the questions that we have to answer, because yes. I think one of the things that we know, and for sure, is that the most radicalizing element in a person's consciousness is actually capitalism. Capitalism forces us to reckon with the brutality of the system. Okay, so I'm trying to teach my 11-year-old about the Great Depression. So we just watched The Grapes of Wrath, and there's a marvelous scene at the end of the film where Tom Joad decides to fight for the displaced and the dispossessed, and he says, I don't know why I feel this way, but I have to go and figure this out. I have to figure out answers for why we are so poor, why we are suffering so much, why my people are dying. I have to go away and think about it and try to do something about it. So I think there is, especially during a public health crisis like this, where we see so viscerally the effects of 40 years of austerity. I mean, think about if we had even social democratic governments in every country of the world for the last 40 years, right? I mean, we don't even have to talk about socialist governments. How much better we would be equipped in dealing with this pandemic. rather than 40 years of austerity and cutting of these life-making services. So I think things that capitalism does are the seeds sometimes of political consciousness in people, and the people that you mentioned especially, which are women and the most vulnerable, the people of color and the poor, are at the cutting edge of the system's brutality. So there are no illusions in their mind that, you know, the police are good, or, you know, what politicians never lie. So these are not illusions they hold. So when they organize movements, it naturally has that sort of consciousness imbued in their movements, that they demand that their voices be heard. They demand that they're not going to die making bloody packing chicken in a chicken farm. Okay, so they're just going to walk out. So the system forces you into a sort of political consciousness. But the question you ask is, how do we push that political consciousness to an anti-systemic consciousness or a revolutionary consciousness? And that is a very, very difficult sort of question for us to answer and to figure out, right? Because in the olden days, people on the left would be saying that it is the job of left-wing organizations to do that work. It's the job of the party, as it were. But we have seen in these last 40 years as well that the form of a revolutionary organization, it really needs to be questioned, right? So we cannot have the kind of party form that some of us grew up with in the 80s and 90s. We need to question those forms themselves, because we've seen that they have not sustained the most open, democratic, exploratory, particularly feminist and anti-racist cultures that this moment demands, right? So then if we cannot have that sort of pat answer of, oh, it's the job of the party, then what is our answer? I think the job right now is a collective exploration of these questions through organizing. So for instance, one of the things I always say is, let's at least try to build our schools of resistance, which is, you know, ask people to join a union, right? So these are the primary sort of, schools of consciousness where we push ideas forward. The second that I always say is, in these kind of situations, is my project, you know, for the next, I don't know how many years, but at least for the next decade, what I see as my task is to vernacularize Marxism. That Marxism cannot be this sort of esoteric academic discipline, which is very hard to understand and moreover to be avoided because there are too many hard words. My job, I see, along with others, is to vernacularize Marxism and make the tools that makes Marxism so powerful available to the vast majority of people. So if you are writing or thinking about social reproduction theory, please do not think that union activists won't understand what life-making or social reproduction theory is. They absolutely will. And it is our job to basically work with union activists to generalize these kind of what are theoretical positions, but are really actually practical positions as well, because social reproduction theory is a praxis as well as a theory, that we use it to make sense of the world, but also to change the world. So, you know, my job, as I see it, with like doing the book series and doing these talks, is to basically get these ideas out as much as possible. And that's kind of where I think we can start to explore how to push that consciousness from a general, sort of rejection of the particular workplace to a general rejection of the system as a whole.
I would just add to that, or really just build on that a little bit, to say, one thing that's really clear is people who are working in charities and NGOs and people who are recipients of charities and NGOs are not, they do know the limits of what is happening often, not always, but you know, I think they're sort of aware that of the limits of their organization often. And so that's precisely why I think making sure, or like finding ways to connect with them to help explain those limits with a vernacularized theory, essentially, as Tiffy's suggesting, is really, really crucial. At the same time, so I'd say absolutely that, but you know, likewise, and equally as important, is looking for ways to connect those organizations to people who are already resisting on the ground. Like I think, you know, movements where there's or yeah, where there's any kind of movement, an IWS, like an International Women's Strike, inviting people out to that, doing those sorts of things. So anything that where something is moving on the ground and getting people a sense of feeling of what it's like to self-activate a little bit, because I think there's nothing like that in terms of experiencing a different way of relating to the questions that you have, and talking and bringing people with similar ideas, or ideas that can reinforce each other into contact with each other, is really, really important too. But that's a super tough question. It's the question of conscious, like how do you build a revolutionary consciousness? And we've been suffering, or you know, struggling with that for many, many years as Marxists and feminist Marxists. Yeah.
So I want to say just one thing to build from Sue, is one of the things that we must think about, and as we come away from this crisis, is capitalism is already trying, and will try even harder in the coming days and months, to basically go back to business as usual. Okay. Yes. Go back to the dependence on fossil fuels, to go back to, you know, wars and hunger and starvation. So every little, you know, concession capitalism has had to make to deal with this public health crisis will be immediately withdrawn, if not being withdrawn already. Okay, so our job as Marxists and feminists, our job as the collective left, is basically not to let the system forget. Okay, mm-hmm. So that is sort of reminding, we need to remind ourselves of what we went through this, the lessons we learned, but then we need to remind the system the cost of what it would mean to have this visit upon us through a climate crisis as well, right? So, and the system can only understand our language, which is the language of protest, right? So already you've seen, like in the month of March, there's been 150 strikes in the US. These are all wildcat strikes, okay? So this is the language that the system understands, and we need to use this language as effectively and as widely as possible of strikes and demonstrations and collective action as we come out of this pandemic. Meanwhile, I hope you guys all stay safe and keep your loved ones close.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Tithi. There were a lot of questions which we didn't have time to get to, but we'll make sure that we sort of wrap them all up and put them to Sue and Tithi, and perhaps if they have time, maybe they'll be able to respond, and we can put up a blog post or something on our website. Maybe that's the best way of doing it. But Tithi, Sue, I want to say a big thank you to both of you for sharing your wisdom and your time, and for a really excellent discussion. If you're interested in reading either Women in Work or Social Reproduction Theory, then they're both available through plutobooks.com. And there's actually a 75% off ebook sale going on right now for May Day. So you can head over there and get reading today for next to nothing. So that's pretty good. If you've enjoyed this event, then you should definitely subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're going to be back with another Radical May live event on Monday. And that's with Ben Tippett, Lola Olufemi, and Dawn Foster. They're going to be talking about